The ballroom was awash in golden light, the kind that made even the most ordinary moment feel like a scene from a dream. Except this wasn't one. My hand trembled slightly as I set my glass of sparkling water on the tray of a passing waiter. But before I could step back, a sharp voice sliced through the hum of polite conversation. "She spilled wine on me." The words, coded in accusation, came from the CEO's fiancée, her pristine white evening gown clinging to her figure like it had been painted on. Gasps rippled through the crowd as heads turned, and I froze, caught in the glare of too many curious eyes. The irony was cruel. I hadn't touched a drop of wine all evening. But in that instant, truth mattered less than appearances. I could see it in their expressions, whispers forming, judgments ready to be served. She stood only a few feet away, cradling the deep red stain blooming across her silk like a battle wound, eyes locked on mine as if daring me to defend myself. My throat tightened, but the words wouldn't come. Somewhere behind the circle of onlookers, I caught a glimpse of him, the CEO, standing tall, his gaze sharp and searching. The distance between us felt heavier than the crystal chandeliers above, each second stretching unbearably as I waited for someone, anyone, to break the silence. I told myself to breathe, to keep my chin up, but my pulse betrayed me, hammering in my ears. This was more than a misunderstanding. It was a public trial, and I was already guilty in their eyes. The room seemed to shrink as the fiancée stepped closer, her voice rising with each word. "Look at her. She doesn't even deny it." A few guests shifted uncomfortably, others leaned in, eager for the spectacle to unfold. I could feel the heat crawling up my neck, the flush of humiliation threatening to betray me further. My mind scrambled for an explanation, something that would make sense, but I knew it wouldn't matter. In this world, appearances outweighed truth, and I was already cast as the antagonist in her story. Then, a subtle shift in the air, his footsteps. The CEO moved through the crowd with unhurried precision, each step pulling the weight of authority behind it. His tailored black suit seemed to cut through the golden glow, eyes fixed on me, then on her. The murmurs dimmed, replaced by a collective inhale. She reached for his arm, playing the wounded bride-to-be, tilting her chin toward the stain like a badge of betrayal. "She ruined my dress," she repeated, softer now, but with a sweetness that stung. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the untouched wine glass in my hand, then at the one resting carelessly on a nearby table, the real source of the spill, still trembling from where she had brushed past it earlier. His jaw tightened, but his voice, when it came, was calm, measured, and carried just enough steel to silence the whispers. "Is that so?" he said, stepping past her until we stood almost level, his presence a quiet shield between me and the accusations. The way he looked at me, then, it wasn't pity. It was recognition. His gaze lingered on me for a heartbeat longer than necessary, then, without breaking eye contact, he reached for the glass of wine in his own hand. The stem glinted under the chandelier as he held it out to me, the deep red catching every shard of light. "Here," he said, his tone low but deliberate, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "If anyone's going to hold my wine tonight, it's her." The shift was immediate. The sharp edges of the whispers dulled into startled gasps, followed by the uneasy rustle of guests exchanging glances. I felt the weight of 100 eyes on me, but this time it wasn't the crushing heat of shame. It was something else, something like defiance borrowed from him. The fiancée's smile faltered, her grip tightening on her bouquet until the petals bent under the strain. She opened her mouth to object, but he didn't give her the chance. Turning slightly, he added, "And perhaps next time we'll remember that accidents aren't always caused by the ones we want to blame." The words were polished, almost diplomatic, but the message beneath them was razor-sharp. He was calling her out, without the theatrics, without raising his voice, just a quiet dismantling of her narrative, piece by piece, in front of the people whose opinions she valued most. I took the glass, my fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. The room still felt small, but now it was filled with an entirely different kind of tension. For the first time that evening, I could breathe. And for the first time, she looked uncertain. The rest of the evening unfolded like a scene I wasn't sure I belonged in. Conversations resumed, but every so often, I caught someone stealing a glance at me, as if they were trying to piece together who I was and why the CEO had chosen to side with me so openly. The chandeliers above glimmered like frozen fireworks, their light bouncing off polished marble floors, casting the whole ballroom in a glow that felt almost unreal. But beneath the beauty, there was a crackle in the air, a tension that refused to dissolve. She stayed close to him after that, her perfectly painted smile glued in place, though I noticed the way her shoulders stiffened every time his eyes drifted my way. At one point, I found myself alone near the dessert table, trying to blend into the background. That's when I heard her voice, not the honeyed tone she used in public, but sharp and clipped, hissing something into his ear. I couldn't catch the words, but I didn't need to. The way his jaw tightened, the way he straightened his posture, told me enough. When he turned, his eyes found mine instantly, as if the entire crowd was just noise and I was the only clear point of focus. Slowly, he began walking toward me. The guests seemed to part without realizing it, creating a path between us. My pulse quickened, my hands tightening around the wine glass he had given me, still untouched. I didn't know what he was going to say, or if I was ready to hear it, but I knew without a doubt that the night wasn't done rewriting itself. He stopped just a step away from me, the faint scent of his cologne cutting through the warm mix of wine and roses that hung in the air. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just looked at me, as if searching for something in my expression. Then, in a voice meant only for me, he asked, "Are you all right?" The question was so simple, yet it sliced through the noise around us. I managed a small nod, unsure if my voice would hold steady if I tried to speak. His eyes softened, but there was still a quiet storm brewing in them, a promise of something left unsaid. Before I could respond, a group of guests drifted past, laughing and glancing at us with poorly disguised curiosity. He didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for my wine glass, the very one he'd handed me earlier, and took a slow sip, as if the gesture was meant to erase the sting of what had happened before. Then he returned it to my hand, his fingers brushing mine just long enough to send an unexplainable warmth up my arm. The contact felt deliberate, protective, maybe even defiant. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her watching from across the room. The flicker of anger she tried to hide behind her polite facade was impossible to miss. She leaned in to speak to a guest, but her gaze never left us. I wondered what story she was spinning now, what version of events she was preparing to share. Still, for the first time that evening, I didn't feel the need to shrink away. His presence beside me felt like a shield, and I wasn't sure why that mattered so much, but it did. He didn't move away, even when the room's attention seemed to shift toward us. It was subtle, but I could feel the shift, the way conversations quieted just enough, the way eyes lingered a moment too long. He seemed entirely unfazed, almost as if he wanted them to see. Leaning slightly closer, his tone softened, though it carried a quiet firmness that sent a shiver through me. "Don't let her get to you," he said, his gaze flicking briefly toward his fiancée before locking back on mine. "Not tonight." The words shouldn't have meant as much as they did, but in that moment they felt like an anchor. The band started a slow, romantic song, and couples moved to the dance floor. She was still across the room, laughing too loudly now, as if trying to reclaim the spotlight. I watched as she took a glass from a passing waiter, her movements sharp, almost brittle. He noticed, too, his jaw tightening. Without another word, he stepped closer, his shoulder brushing mine, an unspoken message that he wasn't going anywhere. That simple proximity sent an unsteady rhythm through my chest. I realized then that this wasn't just about a glass of wine. It was about lines being drawn, about unspoken truths that had been simmering beneath the surface for far longer than I'd understood. And in that instant, I felt a dangerous combination of relief and unease. Relief that I wasn't facing this alone, and unease at what standing beside him might cost. The music swelled, the lights dimmed, and for a fleeting second, it felt like the rest of the room had faded away. But her eyes were still on us, and I knew this was far from over. The tension in the air was almost tangible, like a thread pulled too tight, ready to snap at the slightest tug. I could feel her glare from across the room, sharp enough to cut through the soft glow of the chandeliers. The laughter around us felt hollow now, the polite chatter a thin veil over the undercurrent of hostility she was radiating. I wasn't used to being the center of such concentrated disdain, and my fingers curled around the stem of my empty glass, more for something to hold than anything else. He must have sensed it too, because his hand brushed against mine. Deliberate, steady, grounding. That single touch told me he wasn't going to let this spiral without stepping in. My pulse betrayed me, quickening despite my attempts to appear unaffected. Somewhere in the crowd, I caught sight of a few guests watching us with thinly veiled curiosity, their eyes darting between me, him, and her like they were piecing together a story they'd been waiting to confirm. She took a step forward, the click of her heels slicing through the music as if daring the entire room to notice. In her hand, she still held the wine glass, and her smile was too tight, too practiced. I couldn't tell if she was planning to confront me or simply make a scene big enough that the whispers would spread like wildfire. My breath felt shallow, but I kept my chin lifted, knowing that showing fear would only give her more power. Still, a part of me wondered, if this became public, if the wrong version of the story took root, would he still stand beside me then? Her voice cut through the air like the pop of a champagne cork, sharp and unexpected. "Careless, aren't you?" she said, her eyes fixed on me while her fingers tilted the rim of her wine glass ever so slightly. The liquid inside shimmered under the lights, a rich red that seemed almost too intentional in her hand. Guests nearby froze mid-conversation, their heads subtly turning toward us, hungry for a moment of drama to break the polite monotony. My heart thudded in my chest, but I refused to look away from her. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, she let the wine slosh over the edge, a deliberate, languid spill that splattered onto the tablecloth beside me. The collective gasp that followed was deafening, and I felt the weight of a dozen curious stares pressing in. I stayed still, refusing to flinch, even as a few drops splattered near my sleeve. Her smile widened, triumphant, as if she'd just confirmed to the crowd that I was the problem. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. His shadow fell between us, his presence eclipsing the heat of her stare. In one smooth motion, he took the glass from her hand, not to return it, but to offer it to me instead. "If she's guilty of anything," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "it's having better company than most here tonight." The room rippled with murmurs, the scandal turning into a different story entirely. Her painted smile faltered, her composure cracking, while I felt the blood rush to my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the startling realization that he had just chosen my side, publicly without hesitation. The air shifted instantly, as though his words had sliced through the tension and replaced it with something far more dangerous for her, sympathy for me. I caught sight of guests leaning toward each other, whispering, their eyes darting between us and the now stiff fiancée. A woman near the dessert table covered her mouth to hide a smirk, while one of the board members openly shook his head in disapproval toward her. The orchestra in the corner hesitated for a beat, a violin bow hanging midair, before resuming a softer melody, as if the entire room was adjusting to this new balance of power. She tried to laugh it off, a brittle sound that failed to reach her eyes, but her grip on the tablecloth betrayed her. I could see the white of her knuckles as she avoided looking at him directly, instead fussing with her untouched bouquet. He, however, stayed firmly beside me, his presence not just protective, but almost possessive in a way that made my pulse stumble. I could feel the heat of his nearness, the way his gaze lingered on me for a fraction longer than necessary, and it left me more unsettled than the wine incident itself. When the waiter came to discreetly replace the stained tablecloth, It felt symbolic, like the quiet removal of her attempt to humiliate me. I placed the wine glass he'd given me on the new linen with deliberate care, holding it as though it were proof of something neither of us dared to name aloud yet. Around us, the celebration continued. But for me, the rest of the night had already shifted into an entirely different story, one where the villain was no longer hidden in shadows, and the hero had made his first move. The rest of the reception felt like walking through a room where every pair of eyes knew something had changed. Conversation seemed to lower whenever I passed, and I caught glimpses of curious smiles, as if the guests were now seeing me in an entirely different light. The fiancée kept her distance, though her gaze was sharp enough to cut. She clung to her inner circle, whispering quickly before forcing bright, brittle laughter that fooled no one. I could almost hear the silent question circling the crowd. Why had the CEO chosen to protect her instead of his bride? At one point, I found myself near the open balcony, trying to steal a moment of quiet. The air outside was crisp, the city lights below scattered like diamonds, and for the first time since the incident, I felt my shoulders begin to loosen. That's when I heard the soft click of polished shoes approaching. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. The steady rhythm of his steps was already familiar after years of working in the same building, though he had rarely spoken more than pleasantries before tonight. He came to stand beside me, resting his forearms lightly against the balcony railing. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It was almost unnerving how comfortable the silence felt, as though words would only dilute whatever was passing between us. Finally, he said, low enough that no one else could hear, "I don't like when people try to embarrass those who've done nothing wrong." His voice carried no drama, no attempt to impress, just a quiet certainty that somehow made the air feel warmer. I turned to meet his gaze, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that had nothing to do with the wedding at all. He didn't look away when our eyes met, and that steadiness made it impossible to hide the confusion, and if I was honest, the flicker of gratitude rising in me. "You didn't have to do that back there," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, as if the night itself might be listening. His lips curved into something between a smile and a sigh. "Maybe I didn't," he replied, "but I wanted to." The words hung between us, heavier than they should have been for such a simple exchange. Somewhere inside the ballroom, music began to play again, a slow, elegant waltz, and the sound carried through the open doors like a distant invitation neither of us was in a hurry to accept. For a moment, his gaze dropped to the glass in my hand, the very one he'd given me earlier, and there was an almost imperceptible glint of amusement in his expression. "You didn't spill it," he said, his tone laced with the faintest humor. I let out a breath, surprised by the laugh that followed. It wasn't loud, but it was real, and I realized how long it had been since I'd felt something like that in a room full of people who mostly wanted me gone. He shifted, angling his body toward me, and in that simple movement, I felt the rest of the night tilt slightly out of its original orbit. "You've worked here a long time, haven't you?" he asked. It wasn't an idle question. There was something purposeful behind it, as though he'd been paying more attention than I'd ever assumed. My answer was on my lips, but part of me hesitated, sensing that whatever came next might change more than just this evening. "I have," I finally said, my voice steady but carrying the weight of every long shift, every whispered conversation I'd overheard in these halls. Long enough to see more than most people think I do. His eyes didn't waver, and that focus made me feel both exposed and seen. "That's why I knew she was lying," he said plainly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The words hit me with a strange mix of relief and disbelief. All this time, I'd assumed I was invisible to him, just another quiet figure in the background, tidying up after the drama of the powerful. But here he was, standing in front of me on his wedding night, telling me he'd been watching all along. "I saw the way she looked at you," he continued, his tone sharpening just slightly. It wasn't about the wine. It never was. A gust of cool evening air swept through the open doors, carrying with it the faint scent of flowers from the courtyard. Somewhere inside, someone laughed too loudly, a reminder that the rest of the world was still moving, oblivious to the shift happening here. I gripped the glass he'd given me a little tighter, its weight grounding me in the moment. "Why tell me this now?" I asked, unable to stop the question. He glanced toward the ballroom, then back at me, his jaw tightening with a decision. "Because tonight you were the only one who didn't pretend." The sincerity in his voice left no room for misinterpretation, and no space for me to retreat behind old walls. He didn't wait for my reply. Instead, he stepped forward, his presence drawing a subtle, collective shift in the energy around us. Guests near the doorway turned their heads, curiosity sparking in their expressions. The warm glow from the chandeliers spilled into the corridor, brushing against the crisp black of his suit and the polished shine of his shoes. "Come with me," he said, not a request, but a quiet command that seemed to still the air. My heart thudded once, hard, before falling into a rhythm that matched his steps. I followed, the soft click of my shoes echoing faintly in the marble hall. As we crossed the threshold into the ballroom, conversations faltered. Every pair of eyes seemed to find us, some wide with surprise, others narrowing in speculation. His fiancée stood near the center, surrounded by her bridesmaids, the wine stain on her gown now more a mark of accusation than an accident. Her smile froze when she saw me beside him, her fingers tightening around her bouquet as if it could shield her. He didn't break stride, guiding me straight to the front where the officiant had been waiting moments before. Whispers swelled behind us, the kind that slip like shadows through a room too polite to openly gape. He turned to face the crowd, his hand resting lightly but deliberately at my back, an anchor in the sudden tide of attention. "There's something you all should know," he began, his voice carrying without strain. The room held its breath, suspended between anticipation and disbelief, and I realized this wasn't just about the wine anymore. It was about truth, and he was about to pour it into every glass in this room. His gaze swept over the crowd, pausing on a few familiar faces, board members, journalists, relatives whose smiles had always felt rehearsed. "You've been told," he continued, "that she," his eyes flicked briefly to me, "ruined this night." The fiancée shifted uncomfortably, her knuckles whitening against the bouquet. "But the truth," he said, his tone sharpening just enough to slice through the hum of tension, "is that she's the reason this night was possible at all." Gasps scattered across the room like shattered glass. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, torn between wanting to disappear and wanting to hear every word he was willing to say. He took a slow breath, not once removing his hand from the small of my back. When others turned their backs, she didn't. When I had nothing, she gave without asking for anything in return. And yet tonight, someone decided to humiliate her in my presence. His voice was steady, but there was steel underneath, each word chosen like a weapon placed exactly where it would land. The fiancée's face flushed, her lips parting as if to defend herself, but no sound came out. He reached for a waiter's tray passing nearby, took a crystal glass of wine, and, without breaking eye contact with his fiancée, placed it gently in my hand. "If there's someone here worthy of sharing my table tonight," he said, his voice dropping low but carrying to the edges of the room, "it's her." A silence followed, heavier than any applause could have been. I stood there frozen, feeling the weight of the gesture, knowing that every guest had just witnessed a shift they wouldn't forget. The fiancée's expression faltered completely, the practiced elegance slipping into something raw and unguarded. A flash of disbelief, then the simmer of humiliation. Her grip on her own glass trembled before she set it down too quickly, the sharp clink echoing in the quiet. Murmurs began to ripple among the guests, low at first, then swelling into an audible current. Some avoided meeting her gaze. Others openly stared, caught between curiosity and discomfort. The photographers, sensing the moment's gravity, lowered their cameras, as though even the click of a shutter might shatter the fragile stillness. The CEO straightened, his voice firm but calm. "If anyone has an issue with my choice, you can address it with me. Now." No one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the venue's chandeliers. The fiancée's parents shifted uneasily in their seats, clearly aware of the public fracture that had just unfolded. She turned her face away, blinking too fast, and I could tell she was searching for the strength to regain control. But the balance of the evening had tipped irrevocably. Then he looked back at me, his eyes softening just enough for only me to notice. "Shall we?" he asked, offering his arm once more. My fingers hesitated before curling around it, the gesture simple yet defiant in front of everyone. Together, we stepped forward, leaving behind the table where whispers swelled like an oncoming tide. I knew that by the time the night ended, the story of this moment would weave itself into every corner of the company, into every conversation among the guests. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something unexpected, not just defended but seen.